All right, let's get right into it. We're going to look at a moment in history that honestly feels almost impossible. A time when one of the world's most powerful empires, a real titan forged in fire, completely, and I mean completely, misjudged a new force that just appeared on its borders. This is the story of how a giant stumbled, not because it was weak, but because it just couldn't wrap its head around a whole new way of fighting a war. And that quote just nails it, doesn't it? It's the perfect frame for what we're talking about. Because new eras, they don't send a memo. They usually just show up as a little whisper, maybe a cloud of dust on the horizon that's super easy to ignore. Well, for the Byzantine Empire in the early 7th century, that little cloud of dust was about to turn into a storm that would literally reshape the world. So to really get the scale of this miscalculation, you have to get inside the mindset of the Byzantine Empire. I mean, this was not some shaky, fragile kingdom. This was the direct successor to Rome, a superpower that had every single reason to believe it was invincible, to be confident, maybe even a little arrogant. And you can see why right here. Just think for a second about what this empire had already lived through. We're talking apocalyptic plagues, constant waves of invaders, brutal civil wars. And they had just won a massive, generation-spanning war against their arch-enemy, Persia. So yeah, they were scarred, they were exhausted, but they were the ones left standing, victorious. And this, right here, is the trap. It's the fatal flaw that can grow out of all that strength. When you've seen it all and you've survived it all, you start to think you know how every story is going to end. You believe you've faced every kind of enemy, every kind of threat. And that is the exact moment you are most vulnerable to something brand new. So, when the first reports started trickling into the golden halls of Constantinople about some, disturbances on the Syrian frontier, the reaction was, well, it was predictable. It was just business as usual. Another border raid, nothing to see here. And the key here is that their logic wasn't lazy. Not at all. It was based on centuries of actual experience. The pattern was always the same. Nomadic tribes from the desert push north, they raid for some loot, and then, eventually, they're either pushed back or they get absorbed into the empire. So officials filed their reports, the veteran legions stood ready, nobody panicked. Why would they? But this time, the rules of the game had just been completely rewritten. The empire had prepared for the same old fight, but what it was about to face was a totally different military philosophy. This was the classic immovable object versus a force that just flowed like water. And this slide just perfectly lays out the mismatch. On one side, you've got the Byzantines. Picture it, legions in glittering imperial armor, a slow, grinding wall of steel and shields built for one thing, a massive head-on collision. On the other side, you've got a force born of the desert, flying sand-worn banners, an army built not for the crash, but for the current. It was a coordinated storm of high-speed cavalry that moved at a pace the Byzantines just couldn't process. So the Desert Army was essentially practicing what we now call operational maneuver warfare. And the goal is pretty simple, actually. It's not to smash into your enemy's strongest point. No. The goal is to refuse that fight altogether. You use your incredible speed to just flow around their strength, hit their weak points, supply lines, isolated units, and force that slow-moving giant to constantly react to your moves until it just wears itself out. And in those early fights, a devastating pattern started to emerge. The Arab cavalry would show up, look like they're going to attack a flank, the big, slow shield wall would start to turn, and then they'd just vanish before the infantry could even do anything, or they'd pretend to run away, luring a confident Byzantine unit into a chase, separating it from the main force, and then boom, they'd regroup in an instant and just annihilate it. The imperial legions were being taken apart, not by a frontal assault, but by being systematically pulled to pieces. But the real shockwave, the big one, wasn't just on the battlefield. It was echoing all the way back in the strategic planning rooms in Constantinople. It was this slow, dawning horror that the goal of these campaigns wasn't just plunder. It was something else, something much bigger. You see, the Byzantines had always seen the massive Syrian desert as their friend, a great big defensive barrier, a sort of moat that protected their rich provinces. But for an army born in the desert, it wasn't a barrier, it was a highway. It was like an open ocean that could navigate at will, letting them pop up and strike from directions the imperial generals never, ever saw coming. Just look at how fast their entire world fell apart. In 632, this whole thing was a minor nuisance, just some seasonal raids. A single year later, by 633, Commanders on the ground are sending frantic messages back home saying, hey, these aren't just raids anymore. These guys are taking and holding ground. And then, in 634, the unthinkable happened. At the Battle of Ajnadayan, a full imperial army was smashed in open combat. The giant had been bloodied, badly.
And that was the revelation. The very foundation of Roman military thinking for almost 1,000 years. The idea that disciplined, heavy infantry would always win had just been proven wrong. Everything they thought they knew about war was suddenly up for debate. And all of this led to the final, world-changing realization. The Byzantines weren't just fighting a new kind of army. They were fighting the military expression of a brand new kind of power. For centuries, they had prepared for raiders. They had defeated raiders. Their entire border defense, their whole strategic mindset, was built to handle that one specific threat. They saw the dust on the horizon and got ready for the same old fight. But what came out of that dust wasn't some loose group of tribes looking for loot. It was a coordinated, ideologically unified, and strategically brilliant military system. A system that adapted, that learned, and that just would not break. And that's it. That is the absolute heart of the entire miscalculation. It wasn't just a tactical mistake or a strategic one. It was a political one. The Byzantines completely failed to recognize that they were witnessing the birth of a new unified state, one that had both the will and the power to permanently redraw the map of their world. And so this leaves us with a question that echoes way, way beyond the 7th century. At what point does a problem you think you understand, a little disturbance you've seen 100 times before, transform into something so new, so powerful, that it actually marks the end of your era and the beginning of a new one? It's a question every great power in every age eventually has to face.